Hey, First Baptist family. My name is Kyle Whisenant. I'm coming to you live from my home office here on the Whisenant estate, as we are, all encouraged to be away from other people while this whole coronavirus thing is going through the community. What I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of start our study of the Sunday school lesson for today, which is Romans 5, 1 through 11, I believe is the verses. Yep, 1 through 11. I wanted to start it kind of with the discussion question that I normally like to lead off with my class. And sadly, we don't have a way to really discuss, but I am going to kind of give us space for the video to pause so that then you can go and talk about this with your family or whoever you happen to be near, or if it's just something you want to sit and write down and kind of think yourself, that's fine. But I'm going to leave a couple spaces in the video for you to pause and just really think about it, because that's how we learn best. Is, we hear information, but then when we take the time to process it and we take the time to think about it, then we start to really put connections into it. And that's the important thing. That's why we do what we do. So the first question that I wanted to lead with right now is the first one that's at the beginning of this book. And I want to read it word for word because I want to make sure I don't forget anything. So if you'll excuse me while I stare at a paper while we're talking. So we live in a basic understanding of cause and effect. All right, with everything we see, we tend to look for some type of cause. And you're going to see in the passage we read today that Paul did this similar line of logic when he walked his Roman readers through the reality of salvation and the Christian life. Sin has an effect on our life, but Paul is also making sure to tell us that so does following Jesus. That also has an effect on our life. So the question that it asks us is, why is it important to find the primary cause behind some type of event? How might a person go about identifying the specific cause that created a specific event? So why do we have to know the cause? And then how do we find out that cause? Okay, so if you'll take a little bit of time, I'm going to cut my video off here. I'll give you a chance to think about it for a little bit. I'll pop the questions up so that you can see what they are. And then I'll come back in. And when you're ready, you can hit play and it'll keep moving. All right, we'll see you in just a bit. All right, so will somebody kind of tell me what are some things that you talked about? What? No, I'm just kidding. I can't hear you anyway. Hopefully you had some good discussion about that. As you know, I'm a social studies teacher or a history teacher in the county, and so I live and breathe history. I love looking at different things that are historical, and any kind of stories like that really they always catch my attention. So when I thought about this whole cause and effect thing, I thought about one of my favorite periods of history, which is the U.S. Civil War. And if you really dig deep into the beginning of the Civil War and the causes of the Civil War, not why we fought, but what caused us to get to the point that a fight began. Depending on how deep you want to go, you could talk about things that happened a week before the firing on Fort Sumter. You could say the firing on Fort Sumter in April 12th of 1861 is the reason why the Civil War started. But if you really dig into it, you could look back and say that when our founding fathers were writing the Constitution, because they put slavery into the Constitution and justified that could be a cause. You could go all the way back to when the first slaves were brought over to the United States. You could go to so many different historical events. It's so difficult, especially with something like the Civil War, to really pinpoint the cause. We can talk about causes, but it's really, really hard to pinpoint the cause. And so when we're thinking about stuff today, Paul's going to be very clear and very definite in what he's talking about. So he's going to say, this is what's going to happen in your life if you give in to sin. This is what happened to everybody before Jesus. And then he's going to lay out very clearly, this is what your life is like now because Jesus came. And when you accept that gift, these are the things that Jesus gives you. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to read the first... let's see, we'll go through the first two verses, all right? So I'll read it from the quarterly, and then you can read it, of course, on your own if you would like to. So Romans 5, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. One thing that I always talk about if I'm teaching Paul in my Sunday school class is that Paul is such an important figure in the New Testament, and so much of what we understand about how God saves us and how God protects us and how we can come closer to God is based on what Paul wrote. And of course, he's writing about Jesus, but Paul is the one that puts those words down for us to read and learn from. One thing that's frustrating about Paul is that Paul can be very comma happy. And if you don't know what I mean, then just read some more of Paul's letters. He likes to use commas a lot. Now, if you read any of my papers that I write for grad school, I like to use commas a lot too. But I have a proofreader in Anna, and she will take care of all those things for me, thankfully, because I am very comma happy, and she understands that commas aren't necessarily the best thing to use all the time. There is a point at which you could stop a sentence with a period and then move on and still say the same thing. So what Paul is using here is the phrase that he uses a lot to help us understand where he is going, and that phrase is therefore, or that word is therefore. Anytime you hear therefore, and I know that we've probably taught this and you've talked about it too, anytime you hear therefore, that means that everything that has come before this passage is now leading up to the conclusion that he is bringing in that therefore. So in the first 4 chapters, Paul is writing about all these things that God has done for us, all the sacrifices that he's made, all the things that he can do for us. And then in chapter 5, he's saying, because of all of that stuff, now you have been justified through faith, and you have peace with God through Jesus Christ. Which, when you really think about it, is a pretty relieving thing. If we know that we are justified not because of us, but we are justified because of God, and we have peace with God because of Jesus, that's pretty relieving. And it's awesome to kind of understand that, because peace, when you think about the word peace, peace usually means that's the absence of conflict. Okay? So when you think about it, the peace of God, that peace that is all-encompassing and takes everything and is the most calming that you can have, is provided because the God of peace is working for us. So the peace of God, which is what we want, is being given to us by the God of peace. So in verse 1, when he talks about that, that's a pretty important thing to remember. That the peace that we need, and especially in times like this, there are people in the world who are looking for peace because there's a lot of bad things going on. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of worry, there's a lot of stress. But looking to God for peace can help to calm those things. Looking to God to help you think through the situation that we're in right now, and to help you make wise decisions and not give in to fear and give in to anger and give in to all those things. That peace of God is the only thing that can take that away. And so it's really important, especially in a time like this, that we understand how important and how crucial this peace of God is. And then when you look through verse 2, and I'm going to look back down and kind of read through it again. Through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. So the benefits that God is giving us are talked about here in verse 2. So all this peace, all this justification has been given to us. We have not earned it. We never will earn it. We never can earn it. It's given to us. And so Paul is saying all those things that I said in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, we get all of those things. And the only reason that we get those things is because Christ paid that price. We are justified because of Christ. We have the peace of God because of Christ. And so none of the things that we get, that we benefit from, the best part about this is that we can just kind of keep moving, and you can chuckle at my not talking correctly. The benefit that comes out of this whole thing is that all these wonderful things that God has given us only come about because of Christ. And that's always been Paul's message, is that none of these things are possible, none of these things could happen if it wasn't for Christ. All right, so let's move on to verses 3 through 4. And I'm going to read those from the quarterly as well. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character, hope. And so you can read that another way. Well, it says that suffering produces perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And so when you're thinking about that, it's kind of hard to look at a verse like this and say, great, so suffering, perfect. And suffering is not just an inconvenience. Suffering is not just something that makes you uncomfortable. Suffering is a serious event. And so reading this and saying, Great. So I get suffering. Perfect. Paul is making sure that even though he's mentioning the suffering part, he's going to say, but wait, you're not just getting suffering, but think about the things that suffering can give you. What are the things that suffering can produce out of you? And so he's saying, yes, there's not going to be 100% easy times all the time once you become a Christian and you give your life to Jesus. But these things that you will suffer through because you have Jesus, you will get perseverance. You will have character. You will have hope. And those things are really important for us to know and to remember. Because anytime you see suffering, it's only human for us to say, I don't want any part of that. There may be a situation at work or a situation in your family where things are going to be difficult and they're going to be hard. And you may look at that situation and say, I'm good. I don't want to be a part of that. That looks like it's going to be really difficult, and I don't want to have to deal with it. But what Paul is saying is that suffering is something that we have to experience. And when we do experience those things, think about what you can get from that suffering. This verse, especially verses 3 and 4, really reminded me of my favorite verse or a life verse of mine, which is James 1, 2 through 4. And I wanted to show you this is... I've had this now for about a year and a half, and I never thought I would be a person to get a tattoo. I knew that if I was going to, it'd have to be something that I was encouraged by and something that I wanted to see for the rest of my life, even when my skin gets nice and wrinkly and everything on my wrist. But that verse talks all about pushing through, because it says, dear brothers, anytime you experience any kind of trial and tribulation, it is working on your faith. Or specifically in the NIV, it says, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. And I chose to have that on my arm because I've always had an issue with not wanting to deal with the hard things, not wanting to confront them head on, and always trying to avoid them as much as possible. And I had an issue with anxiety a couple years ago where it just kind of overwhelmed my life. Everything that I saw, everything that I experienced was just too much emotion. It would just bog me down, and it would it overwhelmed me, and I wasn't really able to function the way that I should be able to. And through counseling and through talking to different doctors and all those things, I really grew to understand why there are trials, why there are tribulations in life, and how it can make me a better Christian, how it can hone me, how it can, and I'm not saying I'm the greatest Christian because that's nowhere near the truth, but how it can help me in my walk to become stronger in my faith. And so I chose to get that tattoo because I wanted that to be a constant reminder to me every single day, especially in the summertime when I'm wearing short sleeves, every single day that I can look down at that, and when there is something that's difficult that's going on, I can look at that and remind myself, you are going through these trials and tribulations, and it's going to make you a better person. And so I made sure that when I got that tattoo, that it would be someplace that was very visible, that was easy for me to see, that it was big enough that it could not be forgotten or overlooked. And I refer to it almost daily. Anytime something difficult comes my way, it's always a good remembrance. And Paul's doing the same thing in verses 3 and 4. He's reminding us that suffering will be there, but it's not for nothing. Suffering is going to produce character. It's going to produce perseverance, and it's also going to produce hope. So let's read verse 5. So verse 5 says, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. So when you think about this, Paul's talking that hope is not just wishful thinking. He's not just saying, I hope that this is going to happen. But what this gives us, this hope he's talking about, is hope. It's confident expectation that God is going to bring life, going to bring our walk and our lives to completion. But again, the only way that happens is through Jesus Christ. And so the hope is knowing that it's going to happen. It's not hoping, it's having hope because something has already happened. So if you're hoping for something, you're waiting for it to happen. But when you have hope about something, it's because you know it's already happened. You know that it's going to continue. And so that hope gives you confidence in Jesus and confidence in your life. Here's another discussion question at the end of this section, and so feel free to discuss, write down any kind of thoughts, any kind of notes that you have. But here's the question, and it's a long one, so just brace yourself. Can you think of times in your life when God has used difficulties to produce endurance, character, and hope? Were you able to see the difficulties as opportunities for growth, Or did you see them only as obstacles to your own happiness? Read it one more time. Can you think of times in your life when God has used difficulties to produce endurance, character, and hope? Were you able to see the difficulties as opportunities for growth, or did you see them only as obstacles to your own happiness? All right, we'll check back in just a second. You want to go ahead and pause the video. You can talk and write and whatever you want to do for these questions, and then we'll get right back to it. Talking, it's time to get back to Sunday school. Just kidding. All right, so let's look at verse 6. We're just going to talk about one verse right here. So in verse 6, it says, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." So if you look, Paul's using some pretty strong words. Powerless and ungodly are pretty heavy words. And so what he's saying in these parts is that when you think of the word powerless, that thinks of somebody who is weak, somebody who's sick, somebody who doesn't have any option to do anything. Who has no way of changing something or making a decision or doing anything at all. And so Paul is using that word to compare our situation before Christ died for us, because we had no choice. There was nothing that we could do, nothing under our own power, nothing that we collectively could do. As humanity, we couldn't save ourselves. As humanity, we couldn't protect ourselves. We couldn't save ourselves. We couldn't do any of that. Christ is the only person who could do that for us. And then when it's talking about us being ungodly, that's a pretty heavy word too. And so what Paul is saying is that we were in open rebellion to God's law. And of course we were, and we still are. We still have to come and reconcile ourselves to God's law, even though we don't follow God's law the same way the Hebrews did. If we know from reading the Old Testament, the Hebrews were in open rebellion to God's law for much of their history. But we still are as well. Even though the law is different and it's interpreted differently to us today, we still rebel against that. And so we're still kind of living that same cycle. But we also have a much easier way to reconcile ourselves to God. I know if you've ever taken the time, and it can be difficult because it's hard to read. If you read through Leviticus, when God is giving Moses the rules for sacrifices and the rules for atonement, there are so many different types of rules and things that have to be followed to the T. About sprinkling blood on the altar, and there's a certain day that you can do that, and people of a certain wealth brought these types of animals, and people that were poor brought these types of animals, and how many you were supposed to bring, and what type of animal it was. There were so many different rules that needed to be followed for someone to be atoned for, or for someone to be right with God. They weren't forgiven, but they were brought back into the community. Sometimes physically they were brought back into the community, because if they were outside of that, they had to live outside the town. But the rules that we follow today are different. And the relationship that we have to God is different. But we're still in open rebellion. We still make those mistakes, and we make those wrong decisions. So another thing about this verse 6 is when it talks about at just the right time. So there's two different theories as to what this means. So some Bible scholars think that at just the right time means that Jesus' birth and his salvation comes along in the right timeline. So from Adam and Eve all the way to the birth of Jesus, everything happened in a certain way. Everything happened the way that it was supposed to. And so you can interpret it that way, and that makes sense. God made this plan, and Jesus came at the right time in the plan. Well, that makes sense. God is in control of it all. But what another theory is that Jesus came at the right time before God was going to display his wrath on sin and sinners. So in both ways, Jesus is still saving us. And so it doesn't really matter which one you believe to be true, because what it's saying is that Jesus came at the right time. Whether he was born in the timeline at the right time, or whether he came before punishment was going to be meted out to everybody else, Jesus came at the right time, which makes sense. Of course, he comes just when we need him. And so verse 6 is a short verse, but it's chock full of a lot of really good things. So let's move on to verses 7 and 8. So Paul writes, "Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were sinners, Christ died for us." So in verses 7 and 8, Paul was really helping us understand the magnitude of Jesus' sacrifice. Because when he says that it very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might dare to die. What he's saying is that a good person, what it means by a good person would be somebody who is related to you that you know really, really well, or a friend or that kind of thing. That people would be willing to sacrifice themselves for a family member or for somebody that they know. But even if there was a stranger who was a morally righteous and upright person, it would be harder to find a stranger to choose to die for this person, even if they're morally upright. So even if they're morally upright, it's going to be hard to find somebody to die for them. People are more likely to die for a family member. That's that good relationship. But Paul is saying, understand, Jesus died for complete strangers. Jesus died for people who make fun of him. Jesus died for people who say he's not real. Jesus died for people who continue to blaspheme him, who continue to spit in the face of his teachings. Jesus died for those people too. And so Paul is saying, while as humans, you might die for a family member, you probably wouldn't die for somebody who's morally upright. Think about what Jesus did for you and for everybody else. That it didn't matter if Jesus knew that they liked him, if Jesus knew that they hated him, he still died for them. And so it kind of helps you understand the magnitude of that sacrifice. Because as humans, you're seeing hoarding in grocery stores. And you're seeing hoarding in these different places where people are protecting themselves. They're looking out for themselves. They're not paying attention to the community around them. They're looking out for themselves. And that's what we do. I mean, that's our natural inclination, is to protect ourselves. But Paul is saying that's how amazing this story of Jesus is that he died for people who didn't even like him. And he knew that he was going to save them. And so, verses in 7 and 8 really bring home that idea of we were sinners. We were people who would never do what he did. But he did it for us. Here's our next discussion question, and like the other one, it is a 3-part question. Again, I will put it up on the screen, and you can pause it during that time, but it's a 3-part question, so buckle up. Here we go. Can you think of a situation in which you would willingly give your life for the life of another person? What characteristics of that person might influence you to die for him or her? What was there about us that led Jesus to offer his life for ours? I think that's probably the most important question. So think about in what situation might you give your life for somebody else? And then what characteristics of that person might influence you to make that choice? But I really want you to think about what was there about us that led Jesus to offer his life for ours? Okay? All right, talk about it, write it down, think about it. We'll get back in just a second. So really, when I went through this question and I thought about it, my mind was drawn to the story that came out. Let's see, today is Wednesday, so I think it happened yesterday or early this morning. But there was a pastor in Italy, or a minister in Italy, who was sick with the coronavirus, was in the hospital with the coronavirus, and there weren't enough respirators in the hospital for everybody. And what he chose to do was to give up the use of the respirator for somebody who was younger than him, who needed it too. And he ended up passing away. And so, that I can't help but draw my mind to that story, because that's what we're talking about is he himself didn't know this other person. This person may or may not have been a Christian, but he was. But he didn't think twice about it. Even though he was sick, he gave up that to potentially save the other person. And so he made that decision. And the characteristics, for him really was just that he was a pastor, he was a Christian, and he understands that sacrifice Jesus made, just like what we talked about in verses 7 and 8, verses 7 and 8, the sacrifice that we talked about. And he is able to see that he was able to make that decision too. He was able to live like Christ and make that sacrifice. And to him, it ended up being the sacrifice of his life. But when you think, what was it that led Jesus to give his life for ours? I hope that you really thought about that. And if you haven't, make sure at the end that you think about that too, because that's a really interesting question, to put ourselves in the shoes of God or Jesus and say, what is it about us that makes us so special? So let's look at verse 9. And verse 9 says, since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? So this last section, verses 9 through 11, the quarterly titles it as Justified equals Reconciliation. So Paul is saying, we have been justified. This is how we've been justified. And because we have been justified, we are able to reconcile ourselves to God. And so when Paul talks in verse 9, he's really kind of going for a greater to lesser understanding. Sorry, I just got an email there. And so what it's saying is, if the more difficult, greater statement is true, then the less difficult statement must be true as well. So God has completed the task of declaring us righteous through the death of his Son. So how much more can we trust him to save us from God's wrath directed towards us? So when you look at that sacrificial death, that's the big stuff. That's the big stuff. Because now, even though I know God's wrath sounds bigger than that, God's wrath sounds humongous. But when you think about it, Jesus' death is the big stuff because that ends up saving everything else. Without that death, nothing else matters the way that it does now. And so God's wrath is something that we are able to escape from because we're able to reconcile ourselves back to God. We're not stuck outside of the town forever like Israelites were whenever they committed a sin. We're not stuck outside the town. We may be out there once or twice, but we always have the option to come back once we make that change in our minds and in our hearts. So let's keep going to verse 10. For if, here we go with the commas. All right, I told you that was going to happen. Here we go. For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? And Paul's using some pretty heavy language when he calls us, especially in verse 10, when he calls us God's enemies. Before we were called powerless in the earlier verses, we were called sinners, but here we're seen as God's enemies because truly when you think of the word reconciliation means that you have gone from a hostile relationship. So a relationship where things are very bad. It's not just that things are kind of cool and you don't really talk or you don't really interact very much, but it goes from a hostile relationship to a good relationship. Reconciliation is a major change in a relationship between two people, or in this case, between the human race and God. And so when you look at these verses, he's saying, we've made this major change in our relationship from God to us, and all of it is through Jesus. And so we're going to be saved through Jesus' life because he was able to do the hard stuff. He was able to reconcile us from an era or a place of sinfulness to a place of cleanliness with God. And if he can do that, he can save our lives, right? He can make us, atone for all of these things that we have done because he's already done the biggest part of it. He's done the grunt work. He did the difficult stuff so that we could handle the other things. And so what Paul is saying is that if we were God's enemies and we were able to come back, if we were able to understand, and if we were able to be back in fellowship with God, then how much more can we be saved through this life of Jesus? If he could do that, think about what he could do for you. It's a pretty major call to arms in this verse. It's a very encouraging verse because we know we were already on that one side, but we came over to the other camp. And if we could come over to the other camp because of Jesus, think about what he could do for us. All right, so last verse we want to talk about, verse 11. Not only is this so, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. So not only is this so, is Paul kind of going back to the verses he's talked about earlier, specifically verse 10, to continue to hammer home how important these things are, how important it is to understand that reconciliation and who gave us that reconciliation. Paul is always very good at tying his writings in, even when we go across books in Corinthians and other books that I can't think of right now, Colossians and different books that Paul wrote. There's so much there that is linked. And so it's really important to make sure that you're paying attention to when Paul links things together because he's doing that for a purpose. And it can kind of broaden your understanding of what he's talking about. When we look at that last section, the last question it asks us is, reconciliation changes relationships. Can you think of concrete ways that your changed relationship with God has affected your relationships with people you interact with each day? And so I'll put that question up in just a second. What I want to kind of hit a little bit more about verse 11, because verse 11 builds on this question. So we're going to rejoice when we boast. We're rejoicing about Jesus Christ because he's the only one that brought that reconciliation. His sacrificial death brought that. And it's interesting to see, and the Quarterly says this as well, we should be bragging on God daily for what he's done for us in Christ. And I know in times like this, it can be very stressful, and our life is not normal right now. I mean, at all. I mean, this is something that has not happened in 100 years. A pandemic like this hasn't happened in 100 years. And so our lives have not been upended like this really ever. Anybody who's watching this, your entire life, it's not been upended like this. And so it's hard to boast about God. It's hard to talk to people who are not believers about God because they're going to look at the sickness and they're going to look at the financial situation and they're going to look at the food situation and say, how is God a part of any of this? But God is here. You know, these things that are happening to us right now are temporary, and they're temporary because God is here. They're temporary because Jesus has reconciled us. We're not going to be here long. We're going to go through this life and we're going to experience struggles. We're experiencing struggles right now. But those struggles are making us better. Those struggles are making us more patient. Those struggles are making us persevere. Those struggles are making us more hopeful. There are so many things that the struggles that we're going through right now are contributing to us. And it's good. And it's hard at times. But our relationship with God and this understanding that Jesus' sacrifice was harder than any of this stuff that we're going through right now. But he still made it. He still willingly made it. And what it did is it brought us closer to God. It gave us the reconciliation that we never, ever by ourselves could have brought to ourselves. We couldn't have done it, but Jesus did. So that last question, what are some concrete ways that your changed relationship with God has affected your relationships with people you interact with each day? I think the one thing with this last question, and we'll kind of wrap up this lesson, is looking back at these verses. And we're going to go back to verses 7 and 8. I think these are the big keys of us looking at today. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. You know, when you interact with people day-to-day life, of course, I know some of us aren't even at work right now, but normally when you're interacting with people outside, in your neighborhoods, at your workplace, sometimes it's hard when those people are difficult. They're difficult to get along with, they're resistant to what you say, they may just not like you, and that makes those times difficult to interact with them. But when you look at this question of how has your relationship with God, your changed relationship, remember, enemies of God, we're reconciled. That's our changed relationship. How has that affected how we interact with people every day? Think about verses 7 and 8. Christ willingly died for people who hate him, who hated him back then, who hate him today, who continue to make fun of him, who continue to make fun of Christianity, who continue to make fun of our relationship with him. He willingly chose to die for those people, even though he knew what they were going to do. And if you keep that in mind as you interact with people during the day, you know, your heart softens to them because you know that even though they may be difficult for you, they may be difficult in their interactions with you, Christ still died for them. And he knew he was dying for them. That changes a lot of the way that you understand the people that you interact with because every person that you see, Christ willingly died for. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson. This is very different. Not having discussion is weird, very, very weird. It was nice to be able to pause, though. Usually, if I screw something up in Sunday school, everybody just has to stare at me and wait until I'm able to kind of get everything back on track. But this time, I was able to kind of to cut a little bit and make it more seamless for you. I enjoyed doing this. I miss you guys. Tell you what, I miss the fellowship at First Baptist. I'm very thankful that we're able to see our service online, and it's been nice to worship with my family in the living room. That's been a cool thing, but I miss all of you at First Baptist.